All right, to pick up where we left off, again, it's Unit 1, it's Chapter 2. We were talking about the rise of the Babylonian Empire. And the rise of the Babylonian Empire is going to coincide with the slow decline of Sargon of Akkad and the Akkadian Empire itself. You have to realize that, again, we're competing with a lot of surrounding territories, and so you're going to look at the Amorites and quite a few other folks. Well, the Amorites are going to be the rising faction at this point in time. And the Amorites are going to be led not by Hammurabi, but they're going to be led by a few different factions, a few different groups. And what's going to happen is this, is as Akkad starts to break apart, as it starts to fall down, then what's going to happen in places like Sumer, when you end up with a food shortage means that people are going to be unhappy. As they're going to be unhappy, they're going to be looking to feed themselves, to care for themselves, and they're going to be looking to outside sources. And the outside source in this case is going to be Babylon. But before we get too far into Babylon, I wanted to talk a little bit about religion. And religion is huge at this particular point because we're going to start to play into the biblical version of things. And so I want you to think a little bit about religion and the fact that there's different types. There is a monotheistic religion, and monotheistic means there's one God. Okay, and that's monotheistic. There's polytheistic, which means there might be a greater God, but then there are several gods or goddesses. And then there's pantheistic, okay, which means there's a whole pantheon of gods, such as the Greek or Roman gods along the way. What we start to look at this point is we start to look at both monotheistic and polytheistic gods and setups when we get dealing with the Amorites, when we get dealing with Babylon, we start dealing with the kings and the rise there. The other thing we look at is a change in technology, and technology is huge. Early on in this area, we invent the wheel, but the wheel is for pottery. It's a potter's wheel. It's for spinning this way and creating. It's not until a little bit later on until the actual wheel, as we look at it, for carts comes along. And so they can transport in between the towns. They can transport in between the roads. But also that evolution eventually is going to come along with Babylon, and Babylon is going to take this idea of the wheel and the cart, and we're going to start looking at the beginnings of a chariot, not the ones you see in the movies, not the fast-moving chariots, because they don't come along until a bit later, but it's going to be a slow-drawn war chariot, but even that's not the first evolution. What we look at is we look at the rise of Babylon. Babylon has a better army. They're better led. They're better composed. They're a mightier empire. They have conquered the areas around them, and they're going to see the birth of, among many great kings, they're going to see the birth of Hammurabi. And Hammurabi is where we get our document for this particular unit, and it's Hammurabi's code. And Hammurabi is important because what he does is he takes over for his father, who's a great emperor in the first place, and he takes over and he expands the empire. He pushes the empire up north towards the edges of Assyria. He pushes the empire over towards the edges of Egypt. He pushes the empire over towards the edges of Judah and Israel. He pushes the empire up here and more towards Assyria, and he's going to push it down into Sumer and eventually absorb that. What we discover is this. Hammurabi and the Babylonians have a different technology. One of the things they've decided, and one of the things they've discovered is even though they still have a high saline content in their soil, they have discovered that there are other ways of farming, other ways of irrigating, and they found a better grain to grow. Where they're growing wheat down south in Sumer, here in Babylon, they're growing barley, and barley actually grows better in a higher saline content soil. And so what they can do is eventually when they move down and take over Sumer, when they move down and take over that area, they can feed them. Okay, they can farm, they can be productive, they can feed them. And so even though they take over and they conquer, they're willing to come in. And most of the time when it comes to conquering this area, folks, you don't go in and kill people. You don't go in and destroy the city. You don't go in and disrupt all this. You take over, you don't kill any more than you have to because people are resources. Now, for those of you who are Walking Dead fans, I know I sound like Negan at this point, but it's true. People are resources. If you burn the city, if you destroy, dead people can't farm. Okay, at least not in the real world, they can't. And so you have to look that you go in and you take over, you absorb the land, you absorb the craftsmen, you absorb the people, you take over the city, and they agree to rule. And very often, if they agree to your circumstances, then either you put in a governor or you put in a puppet king, you put in somebody who's going to rule the way you want to, and you expand to there. And that's what Hammurabi does. And Hammurabi gets to be a great king. He gets to create this fantastic law code. He is responsible for the rise of Babylon at this particular point in the Babylonian Empire, or at least the first rendition of the Babylonian Empire. But then what's going to happen is, as he expands, he's going to bump into other groups. Okay, he is going to bump into the Assyrians. He's going to bump into the Hittites. He's going to bump into the Hyksos. And the one they're going to run into that's going to be his downfall, I believe, is going to be the Hittites. And the Hittites are going to come in, and they're going to introduce new weaponry. They're going to introduce a new way of fighting. They're going to introduce something called, iron. And the Hittites and the Assyrians, who are much farther up the delta, figure a more modern Turkey. Okay, it's what they refer to as Anatolia. Okay, but it's modern Turkey, which is more heavier than iron ore. Well, they have more of an abundance of iron, and it's dedicated to the making of weapons and things along that line. And when you are fighting iron versus bronze, hey folks, iron's going to win. Okay. But then when you combine the better tactics, when you combine the better technology with the better tactics and, the better weaponry, it's not a mystery. What's going to happen is they're going to fall. Okay, Babylon's going to fall, but the Hittites aren't hang around people and rule. What they're going to do is they're going to come in, they're going to take over, they're going to take what they want, and they're going to go home. They're going to take their stuff and leave the party. And then Babylon is going to be responsible for picking up the pieces. And what will happen is you're going to have waves of attacks. You're going to have the split up in the area. The Babylonian Empire is going to crumble, and they're going to rise back up. And eventually you're going to have a group called the Neo-Babylonians. And the Neo-Babylonians are important because they make themselves known, but they're eventually going to be replaced too. And what's going to happen is you're going to have an entirely new group come in. What's important about the Neo-Babylonians, what's important about the Babylonian period, is they're going to invade. They're going to invade Israel. And when they invade Israel, they're going to take hostages and bring them out of Israel into Babylon and hold them hostage there. They're going to disrupt the temple. They're trying to make them as much Babylonian as they can. And so they're going to introduce them to Babylonian religion, Babylonian worship. They're going to introduce them to a few things. And what will happen is this is known as a Babylonian captivity. Again, we're biblical, folks, so it's a Babylonian captivity at this particular point of the Israelites. And what will happen is while they're in this Babylonian captivity, Babylon is going to be attacked. It's going to be sacked. It's going to be pillaged. What's going to happen is you're going to have a new player on the field. And that new player, well, that's going to be a brand new empire. You're going to see the rise of a brand new empire. This is where the Persians are going to come in. And the Persians coming in, they're led by Cyrus. And Cyrus is going to make some magnificent changes, because what's going to happen is we again have biblical things happening at this point. We have storyboard things happening. Well, what's going to happen is when he comes in, he's going to bring with him his religion. The Persians are monotheistic, okay? They're monotheistic. They're not polytheistic. They're monotheistic, and they're going to introduce this religion to the Hebrews that are there. And then what he will do is he will say, you know what are these poor people doing here? Why don't we go ahead and send them home? And he's going to send them home to rebuild their temple with the understanding that it is the empire, it is his magnanimous gesture that is indeed setting them loose to go home and to rebuild and to remember this, and they're going to go back and rebuild Israel. Well, what this is this is the start of a brand new birth of an empire, which is going to be huge. So I'm going to pick up and talk a little bit about about Persia in just a little bit.